Hello everyone, today let's talk about the operating exposure management. I am Zijian Wu. And as we all know about that, there is three types of the exchange exposure. They are the transaction exposure, translation exposure, and economic exposures. And all these exposures are related to the risk from unexpected exchange rate changing. The transaction exposure are majorly focused on the special contract in long run, and the translation exposure are related to the revenue convention. And the economic exposure are majorly focused on the long-term impact. And to be simplest, if your company is under the risk to be affected by the unexpected changes in exchange rate, that means your company may under the foreign exchange exposure. And in my opinion, the operating exposure should be more than economic exposure. The operating exposure should be equal to the transactional exposure plus the economic exposures. Because the operating exposure is majorly considering about how the unexpected change in exchange rate will affect the changes in future operating cash flow and the changing in firm's present value. And the current trading may affect the future operating and value of the firm. So that's why we said that the operating exposure is more than economic exposure. And also, it could be measured by the short one to long one. So, the operating exposure management should relate everything about the firm, like your operation, your finance, and your competitor. But there is one focus: your future cash flow. So let's talk about how to measure the operating exposure and how it affecting your business cash flow. The operating exposure could be measured by short run, medium run, and long run. In short run, since the currency denomination cannot be changed, so if there is an unexpected exchange rate occurred, the negative effect could not be neutralized, and your company is under the operating exposure in short run. And in the medium run, if your company is under a equilibrium parity condition, that means your company could adjust your policy to neutralize the effect from the operating exposure. However, if your company is under a disequilibrium parity condition, that means the local government may have some policy and regulation to prohibit your adjustment. Under this condition, company may not able to adjust and neutralize the operating exposure. And in the long run, all the companies should under the operating exposure on the account of uncertainty. Here is an example from General Motors. General Motors experienced the recession in Argentina in 2001 on the account of the depreciation of Argentina peso. The sales and the convent revenue will drop, and General Motors will facing a loss and could not do anything. And in the medium run, if it is under a equilibrium condition, General Motors may try to invest the local plant for manufacture to reduce the component import cost, and also try to do the proactive management to neutralize the future cash flow exposure. In order to handling the risk from experience the operating exposure, we need to do the strategy management. There are two major areas we can focus in the strategy management. The first one is the operating and financing diversification, and the second one is to changing the operating and financing policies. And it requires the company be able to recognize the exposure but not to predict it. And the company also need to consider the competitor pre-position reaction. If the company diversify internationally, that means the company already pre-positioned to the operating exposure, because the international companies are easy to recognize by comparing different area cost, performance, and also easy to respond by margin shift and use their excess capacity and market power. And on the other hand, for the purely domestic company, they are subject to the operating exposure, because it is too hard for them to recognize by comparing with each others, and also it is too hard for them to respond to the operating exposure by relocating their resource. For example, Toyota experienced a loss in 2001 in Europe, but it is easy for it to recognize the operating exposure by comparing the different area performance. And if it is under an equilibrium parity condition, Toyota may invest and expand the manufacture in Turkey and Puerto Grid to neutral the negative effect on weak euro to Japanese yen by increasing the local production. Whereas for the purely domestic company, in the last 10 years, there are a lot of small and mid-sized export-based companies in China are bankrupt on the account of appreciation of RMB. And these are the 4 ways to do the proactive management of the operating exposure. And the key point is to balance the functional currency inflow by a functional currency outflows. What's more, some companies are trying to hedge their operating exposure with a contractual strategies, such as to buy a long-term currency auction. But these actions are limited to the company have a niche market and predictable competitor reaction to the exchange rate changes, such as Tata and Harry Davidson. Their lack of competitor and for a niche market focus. Thank you.